we are. This is the week of the Torah portion and such. So, while the world we've talked about is celebrating a new year, it's really appropriate that we as God's people are celebrating Shabbat. This is a good way to start a new calendar, even though it's not the most important. What's important about this day is not a new year. What's important about this day is what God has called it, and that's the Shabbat. And that's always one to keep that in mind. So much of what we'll be sharing today, it's going to have to do with the symbolic nature of this situation that's described in the Exodus. That reality of life in Egypt for the people of God. The interaction between Moses and Pharaoh, the goal and purpose of what God is trying to do and what he's trying to accomplish and what it says about our current situations. When you look at most of the traditional commentaries and things that are out there, you see that they talk a lot about Egypt and the symbolism that regards to Egypt. And so there's a lot of content about that. And most of the time it focuses on the idea that Egypt is a symbol of sin and death, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, in fact, that's all very true. But I know growing up and hearing that that's the primary way to look at it can sometimes cause us some troubles because we get locked into just that one way of seeing it and understanding it. And so it becomes difficult to see it in any other way. So what I'm going to talk about today is not going to be groundbreaking in any particular way. I realize that, but Egypt, while it does symbolize sin and death, it also represents and symbolizes the world as a whole and all of its systems that we as the people of God live in, interact in, and have to deal with. So much of what Exodus is talking about and what God will do is when his people are too caught up in and too trapped in this world and in this situation and this problem. So what I need to remember is what I'm doing. So this is Exodus chapter 6, and it's Egypt and God's response really to this world system. So that's why the Exodus, really when we look at the Exodus, we need to understand that it is one of those things that we need to add as a go-to kind of book. It's a go-to source for even how God is dealing with this world. And even if you want to go and study the book of Revelation, a lot of times we're studying Revelation, so we look at the prophets, we look at Daniel, we look at some of the other things. But we need to understand that Revelation draws a lot from the book of Exodus. And it's the pattern for how God ends things in Revelation is set up here in the book of Exodus. In the previous Torah portion, if you were reading that last week, we got to see what happens after God's people go down to live in Egypt. Based on their need, based on their circumstances, God's people thought it would be a good idea to leave the land of promise and go down to Egypt, for safety and security, for food and shelter. The people of God stepped out. And they saw it as God's provision. And even they understood that God had given them permission to do so. Speaking to Jacob, it says, so Israel set out, this is Genesis 46, along with everything that belonged to him. When he came to Beersheba, he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And in visions of the night, God said to Israel, Jacob, Jacob, Hineni, he said. I am God, the God of your father, he said. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will turn you into a great nation there. And I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I myself will also most certainly bring you up. And Joseph will put his hand on your eyes. And so this is that situation. God had even a purpose for taking them down there. He was going to be with them even when they're out there in the midst of the world and its systems. He's going to grow them and strengthen them and all that. And for a while, it worked out, didn't it? Egypt was at first a safe place, a place of refuge. They had a relative amount of freedom. They had ability to advance and to grow. And so long as godly people were at the head, or at least people who were recognizing the power and influence of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it was going well for them. It exemplified the proverb that we see. It says, when the righteous thrive, the people rejoice. But it's when the wicked rule that the people begin to groan. And this is certainly true of how things ended, in the book of Genesis, when Joseph is ruling in Egypt. Isn't this what they saw and experienced? When God's people were ruling a nation by God's ways, everybody was thriving. Everybody was doing better. Everybody was able to survive. But then what happens? Joseph dies. And eventually a Pharaoh rises to power who didn't know Joseph, who didn't recognize or acknowledge his contribution, the contribution of his people, or the power and the authority by which he worked and brought blessing to Egypt. And so the wicked came to power. And the people began to cry out and groan. They began to suffer more and more. So Egypt was a nation that for a time acknowledged God, was governed by a godly man or godly principles. Egypt welcomed God's people. But at some point, that godly leadership, that godly influence was lost and replaced by one that rejected God, rejected God's rule, rejected God's people. So what started out as a place of refuge became a place of tyranny and a place of slavery. Now, does any of that sound familiar? Are we seeing any of that kind of pattern today? Where would you say we are on that spectrum, here in America? How did we start out? In general, we started out with a godly nation, at least on paper, people respecting God's ways, and that was the principles by which our government was supposed to be organized. But it's been changing, hasn't it? We're almost at that point where a Pharaoh is coming to power, or will come to power, where that doesn't recognize Joseph, that doesn't know Joseph, that doesn't recognize God and his ways. That spiral to rejecting God, his influence, and his people, that's been increasing, that's been accelerating, and we've been seeing it happen. And what happens to a nation that does that? And so it becomes increasingly dangerous for God's people. And those who don't recognize the authority even of this ungodly, this wicked rule is becoming more dangerous for them. For those who refuse to go along to get along, kind of a thing, or who refuse to comply with everything that's coming down from the wicked rule. God's people are not supposed to follow where the world leads, are we? We're not supposed to go with them and go along with them. But it does, we need to understand, have consequences that we are seeing more and more of in our day. But again, this shouldn't be a surprise to any of us. 1 Peter talks about this. For the time that is past was sufficient for you to carry out the desire of the pagans, living in indecency, lust, drunken binges, orgies, wild parties, and lawless idolatries. I mean, how many of you think a lot of that happened last night? Oh, yeah. But the world, they're surprised that you don't run with them into the same riot of recklessness. They find it strange that you don't go along with them, that you don't want to participate. And so what do? They begin to vilify. They begin to tear down and condemn for not going along with all of that. That should be no surprise, because it's been this way all this time. And so the Israelites began to experience this. And God even used the situation, even in the midst of their persecution, they continued to increase and strengthen. But at some point, God began to act on behalf of his people. He began to raise up leaders to speak his truth so that his people could be delivered. And so God began to attack all of those systems that kept them in slavery, all of those leaders that kept them down. We see in Exodus chapter 6, it says, Adonai said to Moses, "Now you will see what I am going to do to Pharaoh. By way of a strong hand, he will let them go and drive them out of his land." So God began raising up this situation. God has the intention to do something to Pharaoh, to do something to Egypt. Egypt, again, represents the world. It represents its systems. Pharaoh represents that ungodly leadership. But it also, he also responds or represents how the world is going to respond to the things of God. When God begins to move, the actions of Pharaoh parallel what the world does in general. Y'all with me? And so this Torah portion exemplifies the battle that is going on and the struggle that we have, that God's people have, as we are living in these two worlds, in these two kingdoms. There's the kingdom of Egypt, but we're also part of another kingdom, aren't we? We're also supposed to be citizens of a greater kingdom, looking forward to a kingdom that is to come, that is here, and yet not present, that we can see at this time. So we know things about that. Even us today, we know what it means to be living between these two worlds, between the pull of these two systems. We're still having to choose between the ways of God and the ways of the world. That's still going on. That hasn't changed for us. So it's important for us to always keep in mind that while there may be times and periods of peace and prosperity, even as we are living between these two kingdoms, at some point we've got to know and realize that the world and its systems are going to turn on the people of God. Y'all realize that, right? Moses, in many ways, so Egypt is the world and its systems. Pharaoh represents that ungodly leadership and the world's response to what God does. Moses, in many ways, represents God's call to his people to commit to life by God's ways. To not be so torn between the two kingdoms, to not have your loyalty in both places, to not have feet on both sides of the fence. In other words, he represents the right actions and life of God's people. And so the opening passage of this Torah portion reveals God's heart for his people. So in verse 2, he says, God spoke further to Moses and said to him, I am Adonai. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as El Shaddai, yet by my name, Adonai, I made myself known to them. Or many of your translations may say he didn't make himself known to them that way. And just real quick, God, he speaks. And he appears to his people. He desires to communicate with us. And that in and of itself is a special thing. It may feel like he is silent. It may feel like he doesn't speak or he's not at work, but he does. He does it at certain times in certain ways. We may want him to do it more, but the fact that he does at all is itself a miracle. So he is El Shaddai. He is the all-powerful. He is the God of the impossible. And, He demonstrated that reality to the patriarchs, as with a miraculous birth, for example. With this, Jacob was able to see the stairway that went up into the heavens. That he saw the protection and provision of God all along the way. And so many times, because of the different translations that are out there, especially this last part, yet by my name Adonai, or the tetragrammaton, the YHWH, Yud He Vav He, Yehovah. Some people misunderstand this to say that the Israelites never have heard that name before. But their experience of him is really what it's talking about. They knew him primarily as El Shaddai, but they still had heard the name before. Back in Genesis chapter 15, he says, after these things, the word of the Lord, the word of Adonai, the word of Yehovah, came to Abram in a vision, saying, do not fear, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, my Lord Adonai, my Lord Yehovah. Is he speaking the name here? So does he know it? Yes. What will you give me, since I am living without children, and the heir of my household is Eliezer of Damascus? So he clearly knew the name well enough. But when you get to the Adonai, when you get to Yehovah, this name is primarily centered around the covenant and that relationship that is established and built around that reality. Because actually, continuing on in that chapter 15, verse 18, says, on that day Adonai cut a covenant with Abram, saying, I give this land to your seed from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates River. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, that this name is connected to the idea of covenant. And Exodus 6 actually continues with that idea. So Exodus 6, verse 2, verse 4, says, I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land of their pilgrimage, where they had journeyed. Furthermore, I have heard the groaning of Bnei Israel, whom the Egyptians are keeping in bondage, and so I have remembered my covenant. And that's an important thing. Even connecting back to Galatians, where we've been looking at and reading and studying lately, which covenant is God talking about at this point? Is he talking about the Mosaic covenant, the Sinai covenant? No, not yet. That doesn't exist yet. Here in Exodus chapter 6, that covenant has not been set. So he's talking about the Abrahamic covenant. See, God made those certain promises that he will with certainty keep and he will fulfill. But the people weren't necessarily experiencing all of that promise at this point. But he hears their cries of suffering. He knows about their bondage, and God remembers his covenant and his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He remembers the Abrahamic covenant and what he said he was going to do, what he agreed that he will provide for them, that covenant of redemption. That's what he remembers. So everything that happens in the Exodus is because God remembers the Abrahamic covenant. All of his actions of redemption and rescue is him keeping the promises that he made in the Abrahamic covenant. So our redemption and rescue in Messiah Yeshua occurs because of these promises as well. Again, that's the whole thing about Galatians, about getting things in their proper order. We don't come to the Mosaic covenant first. We don't come to the Torah first, and then we are redeemed. We come through belief and faith in what he promised and what he says to Abraham in the Abrahamic covenant. So he remembers his covenant. And then he says, I also established my covenant with them. Whoops. Helps when you do it, right? Therefore say to Bnei Israel, I am Adonai, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from their bondage, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. He says, I will take you to myself as a people, and I will be your God. You will know that I am Adonai your God, who brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. And so I will bring you into the land that I swore to give Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, and give it to you as an inheritance. I am Adonai. So this promise of rescue and redemption, sometimes because of how we experience things, sometimes it's hard to believe. Even for the people of God, we have a hard time believing it because of the life that we have and experience in Egypt. We understand the world systems. That makes sense to us. That part makes sense more. We experience it and feel it and know it more than we really know the kingdom of God. It's the kingdom of God and the way it works that is foreign to us, because we haven't really seen it in operation yet. Not the way it should be. We understand, even though we don't necessarily like Egypt and the world systems and the way it works, we understand how that operates. And we may not like it. We realize it doesn't treat us well or the way we would like, but it makes more sense sometimes. And that brings out another reason why God's people don't always hear or respond correctly to what God is doing. Because not only that we understand the world and we understand Egypt better, there's also this part. In Exodus chapter 6, verse 9, it says, Moses spoke this way to Bnei Israel, but they did not listen to him because of their broken spirit and their cruel bondage. This broken, that word broken up there could also be translated as anguish or shortened, their short heart or their impatient heart. Cruel bondage can also, it's that hard, that severe, that intense even, but it also has the idea of stiff-necked and stubborn. So when you think about it, think about the kinds of things that break people's spirits. What are the kind of things that break our spirits? What kind of things are we experiencing and witnessing breaking people's spirits today? Isolation is one of those things, right? All of these COVID measures that are going out in the world are breaking people. Suicide rates are increased, depression and all those other types of, every type of study that you can do to magnify or to figure out how people are doing. All of those studies are saying people's general welfare and spirit are going down and declining. You see about the slow giving up of rights and freedoms. The sudden steps that get taken to isolate, for example. We keep hearing about the promises. Oh, if you just do this, you'll get back to normal. Right? But it's just one thing after another, variant after variant, excuse after excuse. And that breaks people's spirit. Because they want things to get back to normal. If you'll just do this, if you'll just comply, you'll get your rights back. Oh, not yet. You'll get maybe one more thing. Do this. And then the goalposts move again. And they keep moving. Some people are already broken into despair. Some people are so broken by their fear that they're actually welcoming their freedoms being taken away. And they're welcome for their own freedoms to be taken away, but they also want yours to be taken away. anything to lessen the fear, anything to make them feel safer. And yet the numbers of all these things, of all the COVID stuff, are still increasing. Despite the more that we give up, is it slowing anything down? No, it's really not. Despite all the loss of freedoms, it hasn't really changed anything. So we must do even more. You must give up even more. And people are willing to do it. And that's a broken spirit. Those who talk about, here's the other kicker, it's those who talk about returning to freedom. Those people who talk about we need to reestablish our rights and go back to normal in spite of the potential danger, it's those people. Those people are the problem. Those people are the real danger. They're the ones that are making it less safe for everybody. They're the ones that are being selfish. Y'all hear that? And so aren't they heaping abuse upon those who refuse to go along? Pharaoh is not the real problem in Egypt. Moses is the problem. The one who is truly calling people to freedom. He is the problem. And that's how it plays out even in Exodus, isn't it? When Moses comes in and says, "Let my people go," how does Pharaoh respond? He makes it harder on them, doesn't it? And who do they blame? Do they blame Pharaoh? No. They put it all on Moses. That's how it's playing out even today. But surely we're not in that kind of cruel bondage today, right? We're not like the Israelites in Egypt. We're not being persecuted like that. Aren't we seeing work restricted? Aren't we seeing threats of restrictions put in place until you get compliant? And even then, even when you are compliant, aren't the restrictions often still in place? Are we not a people in America that are still in cruel bondage? Maybe not in the way they were, but aren't we in bondage to debt? Aren't we in bondage to technology, to entertainment, to what we grew up with in our traditions? Aren't all these different ways that we're in bondage to a system in a world that doesn't really care for us at all? And yet, the Father is calling his people out. He is calling his people to freedom in relationship with him and being taught to walk in his ways. That's what he is still calling his people to. And sadly, too many of God's people are not listening. They cannot hear it. They can't hear God's call to his people not to live by the world's rules and its systems, because we have a broken spirit even today, and we are living in that kind of bondage. And when God's people don't heed his call and his instructions, how do we expect God, or how do we expect Pharaoh and the world to respond? How does Pharaoh respond to all of this? Even when we know Pharaoh and the world won't listen, even when we know God's people won't listen because of their broken spirit, is God still trying to speak? Yes. Is God still sending a messenger like Moses to go and share the message? Does God not expect us, even when we know the world's not necessarily going to listen, even when we know God's people aren't necessarily going to listen, does he still expect us to speak? Yes, he does. That same thing is true of us as it was for Moses. Even when we don't get the response that we would like to see, even when we don't get the response that we would like to hear, that does not mean we should quit and give up with it. We should continue to speak God's truth as he has called us to that freedom. We must still act upon the call and the word that the Father has revealed to us. And when the world doesn't listen, when God's people don't listen, can God still increase his glory? Yes, he can. In fact, a lot of times it's revealed even more when there is that resistance to God and his ways. You look at Exodus chapter 7, verse 1. It says, So Adonai said to Moses, See, I have set you as God to Pharaoh, and Aaron your brother will be your prophet, and you are to speak all that I command you, and Aaron your brother is to speak to Pharaoh, so that he will let Bnei Israel go out of his hand. Yet I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt. Even though Pharaoh is not going to respond, his signs and wonders are still going to increase. But Pharaoh will not listen to you. So I will lay my hand upon Egypt and bring forth my armies, my people Bnei Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great judgments. And the Egyptians will know, after all of that, they're going to know that I am Adonai when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out Bnei Israel from among them. So we see this in Exodus. The more that God moves and the more that God speaks, would you say the more or less resistant Pharaoh becomes? More. They become more resistant to God and his ways. The more God moves in this world, we should expect the more resistant the world becomes to what God is doing. So we see Pharaoh making life harder on the Israelites, increasing their quota of bricks, providing less and less, but demanding more and more. And then they blame the problem increasingly on Moses, the one speaking and offering freedom, as the problem. He's the problem. Those that are speaking God's truth are the problem. Those that are not complying are the problem. They don't see the one that's imposing the oppression as the problem. They see anybody who's not going along with it as the problem. So Pharaoh's heart being hardened is just like the world will react. Increasingly stubborn, increasingly hostile to God and his ways, increasingly taking out their frustration more and more on God's people. That's the pattern that repeats in the book of Exodus. It's the pattern that we see throughout history. It's the pattern that's repeating today. It's the pattern that's going to repeat in the future. But notice God's goal in doing all of this. For one thing, it's so that Egypt will know that God is who he says he is. But he also talks about this. Even in spite of all of this stuff going on, God's still going to do what? He's going to bring forth my armies, my people. He's going to gather his people. He is going to bring them and draw them out. His multitudes of people that are essentially prepared for battle. He will gather them to himself and teach them his ways. But when Pharaoh, when the world is hard and stubborn, notice what God begins to strike. Verse 14, it says, Then Adonai said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is stubborn. He refuses to let the people go. So go to Pharaoh in the morning as he is coming out to the water and stand ready to meet him by the bank of the Nile. Take the staff that was transformed into a serpent in your hand. You are to say to him, Adonai, God of the Hebrews, has sent me to you, saying, Let my people go so they may serve me in the wilderness. And behold, you have not listened. So this is what Adonai says. By this you will know that I am Adonai. Behold, I will strike the waters that are in the river with the staff that is in my hand, and they will be turned to blood. The fish that are in the river will die. The river will become foul, and the Egyptians will hate to drink water from the Nile. So, one thing that this shows is like the very first thing that God targets in the world system was the heart and life of the entire culture. The entire economy of Egypt was dependent upon that river. The one thing that most made their culture work was actually turned against them. Their belief system, their economics, their food supply, all of it failed and became a source of sickness. Are we seeing anything like that going on? Take a look at some of these pictures. I have some of these maps of Egypt. So you have the Mediterranean is up here. You know, the Nile is one of the few rivers that flows south to north. But you have this is what's called Lower Egypt up here. Goshen is over in this area where the Israelites primarily were. Down here is Thebes, where Luxor and some of the more famous tombs and treasures were found. This is called Upper Egypt. All this stuff out here is desert. All this stuff over here is desert. The only stretch of green is the little strip of the river itself. You have a few oases out here, but they're not enough to build something on. In fact, when you look at the river, this is what it can look like. You've got the deserts out here. You've got the deserts on the other side. This is the floodplain of the Nile. And it has a rich black soil that's sediment from where it all starts. And when the river floods, it fills in that area. One of their hardships that they're having nowadays is that the water is a lot more controlled than it used to be, and it doesn't flood in Egypt like it used to. So, but when you look at the Nile itself, it's actually a lot bigger than what's just in Egypt. Egypt is, Egypt is just this part right up here. And when you think about the Nile River, even today, 95% of the Egyptians live within just a few miles of the Nile. So almost the entire population of Egypt is along that river. Egypt itself typically gets less than 10 inches of rain in a year. So all of their water comes from the Nile. And Ty, we went out on the lake last week, right? And it was amazing how low that water got, right, in places. The Nile is typically 8 to 11 meters deep, 25 to 35 feet deep all the time. And they say that it registers about 3.1 million gallons per second is what's coming through and flowing through the Nile. That is massive. It's considered the longest river in the world. It's over 4,000 miles long, 4,160. I saw every place I looked gave me a different number. And what's interesting though is only about 700 miles of it is actually in Egypt. So it's over 4,000 miles long, but only 700 miles of it's in Egypt. So 22% of the Nile is what's in Egypt. The rest goes through 9 other countries on the continent of Africa. So looking at some of these other ones, that doesn't show up very well. So again, you've got Ethiopia over here. This was a branch called the Blue Nile. This is the White Nile. It comes all the way through Sudan, South Sudan, Uganda. Makes it to what is essentially Lake Victoria. This is a little bit of a zoom in. You'll see this place in the news sometimes. The dam that Ethiopia built, that's created a lot of trouble and a lot of problems for them. Let's see here. So yeah, this is Lake Victoria down here in Uganda and Kenya. And it starts some of these areas flowing into this, and then this is the beginning of the Nile. And what's really interesting, when you think about this, if you remember, I'm going to back up a little bit to this picture. When you read about the drought that occurred in Joseph's day, or when you read about the Nile turning to blood, it wasn't necessarily because of anything that happened in Egypt. You know, Egypt, again, gets less than 10 inches of rain a year. So when the drought happened, guess where the drought was? Drought was here. Because this is more of a rainforest area. But because they didn't get rain up here, it didn't flood down here into Egypt. So Egypt was suffering because of things that happened upstream. It wasn't because of things that necessarily directly happened in Egypt. You know, maybe there was a drought because there was a landslide or something blocked the river for whatever reason and diverted the water elsewhere. You know, do we know what that experience is like? It's not necessarily things that happen here that's the problem, right? It may be a virus that gets released somewhere in China that's causing problems over here. See, everything that Egypt thought that they knew, everything that they depended on, everything that they thought they had control over was hit. You know, and so they experienced through all of the plagues, the sickness and the disease, and their economy fell apart and collapsed. And see, sometimes they thought they had a response. Sometimes they thought they could control the situation or even mimic or counter what God was doing. You know, they're magicians trying to turn their staffs into serpents, or making blood appear in water, or make a miracle cure and a vaccine for a disease. They thought they could fix it. They thought they could match it. They thought they could handle it. But those claims of replicating or countering the situation, did they really stop what God was doing and where he was going? Yes, they could replicate the serpents. Yes, they could replicate the blood in the Nile. That didn't stop what God was doing. Exodus chapter 8 says, when the magicians attempted the same with their secret arts to bring forth the gnats, all of a sudden they couldn't. See, while we may think that we can go along and match the things that are happening to us for a little while, it's going to come to a point where we're not going to be able to counter what we think God is doing. There were gnats on the men and the animals. So the magician said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them, just as Adonai had said. At some point, the way the world works and the world systems, at some point, nothing the world does is going to bring them relief. They'll not be able to stand against him. And the same thing is true for us. Nothing the world does is going to be able to stand against what God is doing, even though we are going to try. You know, he says, man, I keep doing this backwards. Exodus chapter 9, verse 10 says, so they took soot from the furnace and stood before Pharaoh, When Moses threw it up heavenward, it became boils erupting with sores on both men and animals. Moreover, the magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils, because they were on the magicians as on all of the Egyptians. So eventually they won't be able to stand before God's people. Not just stand before God, but eventually they won't be able to stand before God's people whom they are persecuting. But the other good thing about it all is that God's people need to understand something that we see here in this portion. Something that gives us hope. Something that gives us expectation as we see things happening at this time. Because at first, what happens when the plagues start coming on Egypt? Are God's people caught up in it? Yeah. God's people are experiencing the same kind of things. God's people are affected by the Nile. They're affected by the frogs. But the longer these things go on, the more God begins to make a distinction between the world and the citizens that go along with that system and God's people. He says, on that day I will set apart the land of Goshen where my people are dwelling. Except no swarm of flies will be there, so that you may know that I, Adonai, am in the midst of the earth. I will make a distinction between my people and your people. He says it again in chapter 9. But Adonai will make a distinction between the cattle of Israel and the cattle of Egypt, and nothing will die that belongs to Bnei Israel. See, I'm getting ahead of myself again. So the people of God, at some point, even though God is attacking the world systems, He's attacking the economy, He's attacking the religions, He's attacking all of these things that are standing up and trying to persecute His people. The people of God, at some point, will be protected from all of those things and all of those responses that are happening. Their land is protected, their property is protected, their health is protected, even the light of their homes is protected. So God will not allow those like Pharaoh, those like the world and its systems to come crashing down on God's people in the same way that it does everybody else. God's people will be freed and redeemed. God's people will no longer be under that world system, under that kingdom. Our citizenship will no longer be torn in those two directions, but we will be going and moving towards the people of God. And so even though we may be seeing the pattern repeating in our day, we also need to hold on to that reality of where God is taking His people. We need to understand that the pattern is repeating, and if this Exodus is setting the pattern, then we'll be leaving the likes of Pharaoh and this world's authority. And it may come soon. Because as he says in Colossians, it says, He has rescued us from the domain of darkness, and He has brought us into the kingdom of the Son He loves. In Him we have redemption, the release or the forgiveness of sins. In spite of everything that may be going on in our day, in spite of the pattern that we may be seeing in the world's attempts to match it that are failing, are they not? All the things that the world is trying to do to protect itself are not working. But we know that this is where it's going. Even though we may get caught up in it for a little while, we have to know that our freedom and our release is all the closer. That's where He's going. That's how God responds and moves and works when He is going after this world and this system that is enslaving His people. And we must have ears to hear what he is doing, what he is saying, and how he is moving. Our spirits must not be broken by the bondage that the world is experiencing, so that we no longer are able to hear what God is telling us and telling his people. And even though many people they aren't listening, we still have to be faithful to speak what he has told us to speak, even in front of Pharaoh, even in front of the world and its systems. We must speak the truth of God and his kingdom and his righteousness in all things. Amen.